Moving on to our next speaker from the US, Brian Sylvester is joining us with the Zoom application. He's a special counsel at Covington and Burling LLP. He advised food, dietary supplements, cosmetic, and over-the-counter drug clients on a broad range of regulatory, legislative, and compliance issues before FDA, USDA, and analogs food and drug regulatory bodies. He has specific expertise in developing regulatory strategies to commercialize alternative proteins using plant, microbial, and animal cell-based technologies. His practice additionally encompasses veterinary pharmaceuticals and biological products, pet food and animal feed. Drawing on his tenure as a regulatory lawyer with the USDA, Mr. Sylvester has particular experience counseling clients on strategic considerations around engagement with the advocacy before USDA and FDA on a range of complex issues, including those of first impression. He is a prolific author and frequent speaker at industry-leading events in the US, and such as ours, and around the world. And he is regularly called upon to offer insights on trending legal issues by publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Food Navigator USA, among others. So, Brian, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. The stage is all yours. Good luck.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm thrilled to be with everyone this afternoon to talk about U.S. Regulatory 101 for alternative proteins. Today, we're going to cover some high-level issues that everyone in this industry should be aware of when thinking about plant-based foods, flora-based foods, which are foods produced through fermentation, dairy products, for example, flora-based, and then cell-based foods, cell-based meat in particular. So we only have about 25 minutes for our presentation today, plus Q&A. And so we're going to try to get through this as quickly as possible. And just to recap my background, I work at Covington and Burling. It's an international law firm headquartered in Washington, D.C. We have contacts all around the world, including on the ground in Israel. And we're very much part of the alternative protein sector on the cutting edge of the regulatory developments in the US and around the world. So there's certainly a lot of fascination with regard to alternative proteins. When it comes to cell culture technology in particular, there's an evolving regulatory conversation in the United States regarding how best to regulate this sector. But for flora-based as well as plant-based foods generally, there's been a lot of interest among consumers and among life science companies and among startups, entrepreneurs, trying to figure out how to get into this sector and how to do so safely. And while the technology piece is certainly very important, it's also equally important to consider the regulatory landscape, because without proving safety from a regulatory standpoint, you can't get the products out to market. So in the United States, we have two key food regulators, which is a little bit different from most parts of the world where there's one key food regulator. So in the United States, we have the FDA and the USDA. So for today's agenda, I've laid it out right here. We're going to talk about the framework at a high level in the United States, the key regulatory considerations for alternative proteins in particular, the evolving pathway for cell-based meat, labeling issues, import requirements, and then some new developments regarding food safety as a whole at the FDA in the United States. So in the United States, we have the FDA and the USDA, the US Food and Drug Administration and the United States Department of Agriculture. So there is a division of jurisdiction. The USDA covers all products containing meat or poultry products, except those products containing 3% or less raw meat or poultry, or 2% or less cooked meat or poultry. There's a bunch of other distinctions as well. The USDA covers processed eggs, whereas the FDA covers shell eggs. The FDA covers closed-face sandwiches, whereas the USDA covers open-face sandwiches. So that's why it's really important to have the right compliance counsel by your side, because there's a lot of rules and policies that don't necessarily make sense, but they're on the books and they could be a problem as you develop your technology. So the key laws in the United States at the FDA would be the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And for the USDA, we have a couple statutes, the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, and the Egg Products Inspection Act. There's a lot of existing laws on the books, and the thinking around alternative proteins is that the existing laws are such that they accommodate new technologies. So FDA, as many of you may know, has broad authority to regulate most foods. They determine the safety of new food ingredients, including those used in both plant-based foods as well as those used in meat or poultry products. FDA regulates food products of biotechnology. They regulate microbial, algal, and fungal cells. They regulate animal cell culture technology in therapeutic settings, as well as processing, manufacture, and packaging of seafood, except for catfish, which again is another distinction. That's actually going to be USDA. USDA regulates meat and meat food products, as well as poultry and poultry food products under the statutes I just mentioned. USDA regulates establishments that slaughter and or process meat or poultry products and all processing activities like mixing, grinding, cooking, smoking. And USDA really focuses on the wholesomeness and accuracy of the foods under its purview. So the key regulatory considerations for alternative proteins and for many foods is really the pre-market safety piece, the manufacturing piece, and the labeling piece. It's reasonable to conclude that from a pre-market safety standpoint, FDA will be very concerned about all of the substances that are used in the manufacturing process. FDA will want you to assess whether there's any manufacturing changes or whether any manufacturing changes or affects the identity, conditions of use, purity, toxicity, or safety, the identity, history of safe use, common knowledge of safety, technical effect, and the intended use in particular. What is the margin of exposure? And there's a lot of tools that FDA has, such as the food additive process and the GRAS process, which is called generally recognized as safe. It's a process by which a food ingredient company can come to a safety conclusion on its own, and it can then submit that safety conclusion determination to the FDA for a concurrence, for a no objections letter. That could be an entire session onto its own, but suffice it to say, there are processes in place that FDA has for novel ingredients, such as the ones that are used in plant-based foods and other alternative proteins, to establish a safety so that you can get your product to market and so that consumers can feel safe and that your supply chain customers can also feel that the product is safe. Looking specifically at the world of cultured meat, we know there's a bunch of cultured meat companies that are sprouting up all around the world, including in Israel. They're also in Asia, the United States, all around the world. And there's been a big question regarding how this sector will be regulated. In the United States, we came up with a memorandum of understanding between the two key food regulators back on March 7th, 2019. The two agencies came up with a MOU that outlines how the two agencies would work together to regulate the production of cell-cultured foods produced from cell lines derived from USDA amenable species. So what does that mean in plain English? That means that for any meat or poultry, chicken, beef, duck, etc., that's made through cell culture technology, there will be two regulators that will work hand in hand together. If you're making cell-based seafood, like a tuna or some other type of fish through cell culture technology, you're only dealing with the FDA. So it's a big distinction, and the regulators themselves are trying to figure out how to really flesh out the details of the oversight for this very new sector. As we just talked about, the regulations on the books for USDA for meat processing and meat production really focuses on animal slaughter. So it doesn't think about the production of meat in a bioreactor and the harvesting from the bioreactor. So through this MOU, FDA will oversee regulatory oversight up until the point of harvest from the bioreactor. After harvest, upon harvest, USDA's Food Safety Inspection Service takes the lead on oversight for inspection and labeling. So taking the same chart that I just created for alternative proteins as a whole, we take a specific look at cell-based meat and look at the regulatory pathway and the key considerations all along the way. And again, we have pre-market safety. And we're really focused on purity, toxicity, and safety. Are there any unique hazards, any unique issues that need to be controlled through hazard analysis? And FDA and USDA have on the books a hazard analysis requirement. It's slightly different, but overall, the goal is when you're producing food to identify any potential hazards and identify how you would mitigate those hazards at every step of the production process. Another big issue for cell-based meat, and actually all alternative proteins, is labeling. For cell-based meat, the issue is even more sort of debatable, and it's a very hot button issue because in the United States, we have the cattle producers and the livestock producers who are not necessarily interested in having this new type of production method produce products that are called by the same name. So there's been petitions filed saying that, asking USDA to not allow the terms meat and beef be allowed for these products produced through cell culture technology. So we now know that given all of the controversy, that the USDA will be rolling out new regulatory requirements for the labeling of cell-based meat and poultry. Now, I just mentioned that FDA is the agency overseeing seafood production from cell-based technology, and FDA likewise is at least considering how to go about labeling for cell-based seafood. So they're not necessarily rolling out new requirements, but on October 7th, 2020, the FDA did issue a request for information from stakeholders to get everyone's take on how FDA should go about labeling oversight for cell-based seafood. So as you can see, there's a lot of issues that need to be really unpacked and thought about when you're developing products. Because even though you may have an amazing method for producing products such as cell-based seafood or cell-based chicken, you need to think about how you're going to label the product, what's going to resonate with consumers. So to help flesh out all of these issues on the cell-based meat side, the FDA and the USDA have developed several interagency working groups. The first is focused on pre-market safety. The second is focused on the transfer of jurisdiction. So when you have meat and poultry products, as I mentioned, you have FDA and USDA working hand in hand. And upon harvest from the bioreactor, USDA will take over from FDA. And then, of course, there's another working group focused exclusively on labeling. All of these working groups are eager to meet with startups in this space to learn more about the technology, as this will inform how the agencies will ultimately produce guidance and how they will regulate the sector. So the sooner that stakeholders, not just the startups, but the life science companies as well, and other interested stakeholders should be meeting with the agencies, talking through the technologies, and really helping to push this sector forward. So there have been a lot of labeling developments. And as I just mentioned, labeling is a really key issue for all alternative proteins, no matter how you're producing your food. So we have the bioengineered food disclosure final rule, and the compliance date is officially January 1st of 2022. We also have the FDA, which is having meetings and discussions ongoing regarding the modernization of the food standards of identity. A standard of identity is basically a recipe for a food, essentially. It tells you what the specifications are for particular ingredients and particular foods. And a lot of the standards of identity on the books are dated. And so FDA is interested in getting stakeholders' feedback, and they did collect that feedback back in a public meeting in September of 2019 and in subsequent comments. FDA has also collected comments on the use of names of dairy foods and labeling of plant-based products, another hot button issue where you have a lot of folks in the dairy industry not necessarily a fan of having soy milk and other types of like almond milk and coconut milk using terms that are dairy terms, so to speak. There's also the developments on the cell-based meat side that I just mentioned in the summer and a few weeks ago at the FDA and the USDA regarding cell-based meat. So there are There are new requirements for the new bioengineered food disclosure standard, which are set forth here. And I will not get into too much detail, but the USDA has set forth guidance indicating how you can determine whether there are detectable levels of bioengineered material that needs to be disclosed on packaging. And this will apply to many plant-based foods, and a lot of plant-based food companies have gone ahead on their marketing materials and gone ahead and explained how they've used bioengineering to produce their foods and how they've done so safely. Because there's a big misconception among many consumers in the US and in different parts of the world regarding bioengineering. It's less clear whether or not a bioengineered disclosure would need to be made for various cell-based foods. There are certain rules on the books that would prohibit and exempt, like meat, for example, and poultry products made through cell culture technology from the need to have a bioengineered food disclosure standard at this time, but it's part of the conversation. So let's think about cow-free dairy. This is that flora-based dairy product I was talking about, where you basically produce the casein and milk proteins through fermentation, and you have companies like Perfect Day that are producing ice cream, and you have other companies that are producing cheese and a variety of dairy products. So the question is, do flora-based dairy products qualify as milk products? There is a standard of identity on the books that says that milk is a lacteal secretion from a cow, and it goes on with additional requirements. So obviously, if you're producing the milk proteins in through fermentation, then you're not necessarily meeting that very dated standard of identity. So there is a debate ongoing, and there are states in the United States across the country that are rolling out labeling rules that would prohibit products that are actually produced through fermentation, milk products that are produced through fermentation, from being labeled milk. So you couldn't have like a soy milk. You would have to have soy drink. As I understand in the United Kingdom, for example, you can't call that product soy milk, but it has to be soy drink. So things to that effect, which could impact how consumers interact with your product. So there have been a couple of bills passed that would be restrictive in the ways in which you can use like milk terms and other dairy terms. They've been passed in Maryland, Louisiana, and North Carolina. And there have been other bills that have proposed along similar lines in Virginia, Vermont, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and so forth. There's also a big labeling debate regarding meat products. So there's a bunch of names being thrown around right now for cell-based meat products. We have cultivated meat, cell cultured meat. Some in the press call it lab meat, fake meat. All sorts of names are being thrown around. There's no set nomenclature. So earlier on, about 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, the U.S. Cattlemen's Association filed a petition with the USDA requesting that USDA limit the definition of beef to product from cattle born, raised, and harvested in the traditional manner. And they further requested that the broader definition of meat also be limited to the tissue or flesh of animals that have been, quote, harvested in the traditional manner. This petition has not been responded to by the USDA. There's also been legislation introduced in the United States Congress called the Real Meat Act of 2019. So there's a lot going on, including at the state level. This slide shows you some laws that were passed last year from Alabama to North Dakota, Louisiana, Wyoming, and a bunch of others that were proposed in 2019. As you can see, it's keeping a lot of folks busy trying to keep up with all of the developments, not only at the federal level, but also at the state level. So this has led to some litigation. So in the Missouri law, it prohibits a product that is not derived from harvested production livestock or poultry as meat. You cannot label a plant-based meat product under this law as meat product unless it is actually derived from harvested production livestock. So the Good Food Institute, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and others filed a First Amendment lawsuit challenging this law. So along similar lines, GFI also challenged the law in Louisiana this past fall, in October actually, of this year. The good news is for cell-based meat products that federal preemption is a concept in American law, and it's set to mean that the USDA, whatever they decide at the federal level, will preempt anything at the state level. So it remains to be seen how that all plays out. But for now, we have a lot of state laws that are different to deal with. There is rulemaking on the horizon, and here's an example of a USDA standard of identity for hamburger. As you can see, it lays it out in very detailed terms. And the question is, if I'm making a hamburger from cell-based beef, do I actually qualify for the standard of identity where beef is likely considered in the law to actually be derived from a slaughtered animal? So it's a question that USDA is grappling with. They have an entire working group focused on it. And they now are considering new regulatory requirements for the labeling of products. And I'm sure this kind of exercise going through standards of identity, such as the one for hamburger and many, many others, will be part of that exercise to help inform how the sector deals with the labeling question. As I mentioned, labeling obviously has a ton to do with consumer perception. There's a lot of great articles out there. And there's actually a letter that Harvard sent to the USDA regarding cell-based meat labeling. And there's the question just generally that cultured meat could potentially suffer the same fate as GMOs. So that's why the industry really needs to get out in front of the labeling issue as sort of a united front. So even though you're competitors, it's really important to align on certain core issues that will actually allow the sector as a whole to thrive. So for imports, I'll go over this really, really briefly. For FDA regulated products like seafood products and plant-based meat products, you must be meeting the same legal requirements as domestically produced foods in the United States. Any facility that is engaged in the manufacture, processing, or packaging or holding of the food, even those abroad, must be registered with the FDA as a food facility. And prior notice to FDA that the food is being imported or offered for import must be given. There's also something called the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. That's a set of requirements that all imported foods would need to meet prior to facilitate its import. The USDA also has its own set of import requirements. For instance, any meat or poultry product must originate from what we call an eligible country and from establishments or plants that are certified to export to the United States. There are a number of FSIS requirements that are available on the FSIS website. And one of those key requirements is that you have to be re-inspected upon import to the United States, which is different from FDA. With an FDA regulated product, it's very possible that you would be subject to a random sort of sampling test. But for FSIS, for USDA regulated meat and poultry products, you actually are subject to re-inspection at the border prior to distributing that product in commerce in the United States. There are also certain requirements from USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS for short, and CBP that need to be complied with. And again, lots of information there that could be an entire session onto itself. But suffice it to say, flagging it as a key issue that you would need to confront. And to close out our session today, I wanted to mention that FDA is really focused on leveraging technology to support food safety. And in this regard, there is the FDA New Era of Food Safety Blueprint with 4 core elements as laid out here. There's a new traceability rule that was proposed to help facilitate food safety. And so these are issues that anyone operating in the food space that's interested in the United States market needs to be aware of, and thinking about baking in whole genome sequencing into your food safety protocol, blockchain technology, and so forth. And here's a chart laying out a timeline of some big developments regarding this new initiative. And so looking ahead, I think we can look for further clarification from the FDA and USDA regarding the regulatory framework for the cell-based meat and poultry products. We now know that there will be rulemaking on labeling for cell-based meat, and we now know that there's a RFI. FDA is interested in collecting information from stakeholders regarding the labeling question for cell-based seafood. I think to the extent that new companies have products that are ready, startups have products that are ready before the technology, before the regulations and the guidance actually catch up to the technology, we may see some case-specific determinations. I think we may see some possible pronouncements from the FDA on the labeling of flora-based dairy, since that's another hot button issue. And I think we'll definitely see continued political interest and legislation regarding labeling for all sorts of alternative proteins, from plant-based foods to flora-based foods to the cell-based meat products. I wanted to share a couple articles that I've authored in the recent past. Most recent significant article would be the article for the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. It's a commentary. It was me along with about 6 or 7 meat scientists based in the United States, and it's focused on the policy and technology issues around cell-cultured meat. There are a bunch of other articles here and some quotes as well with some really good articles. So again, I work at Covington and Burling. We have one of the world's largest food, drug, and device regulatory practices. We work with many of the world's most recognized brands, both startups as well as Fortune 100 and 500 companies. We have 2 former chief counsels of the FDA as part of our practice and a number of other senior officials from the FDA. Again, I worked at the USDA, so we have a great team, and we're looking forward to getting to know many of you looking ahead. So I'll stop here and I will pause for questions.
Thank you, Brian. Great presentation. Can you hear me? Brian, can you hear me?
If you could just turn up your volume a little bit, if it's possible.
Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great presentation. We have some questions from the audience. First question is from Amai Proteins, local protein improvement company. And can you elaborate on guidelines, pros and cons of food additives versus grass clearance routes?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So it's a question I deal with all the time, because there's a question as to whether you should go down the food additive petition pathway or the self-GRAS pathway or GRAS notice. So just for our listeners, our viewers who may not be familiar, when you are talking about a new food ingredient, you need to actually be regulated as a food additive unless you can demonstrate that you are generally recognized as safe and therefore exempt from regulation as a food additive. So in many instances, a company producing a novel ingredient will choose to go down the GRAS pathway because it's more efficient. You can actually market your product on the basis of a self-GRAS assessment, and the FDA does not have to actually be involved at all, except that you need to follow certain key requirements laid out in the GRAS rules that FDA has. In terms of the differences between food additive petition pathway and the GRAS assessment pathway, I would say that timing is a big deal. If you want to get your product to market sooner rather than later, you normally go down the GRAS pathway. However, sometimes it's not possible to go down the GRAS pathway. With the GRAS, you need to be relying on publicly available peer-reviewed information. For food additive petitions, that's helpful, but you can also rely on privately generated information that's not publicly available. And so it's really like a case-by-case situation where you really make the best decision for yourself, whether or not you're going to make a GRAS position, if it's possible, and if you're going to go down the food additive pathway. There's a little wrinkle, and I just worked on this actually within the past week, where if something is actually affirmed as GRAS in the regulations, and you're trying to expand that, the types of foods in which that ingredient can be used, in which it's deemed GRAS, there's a regulation that says you actually have to go down the food additive petition pathway. So that's one example of like where the FDA says you actually have to do a food additive petition. But normally when I'm working with companies, we always try to go down the GRAS pathway. Number one, we do a self-assessment. And then number two, we would normally take that self-assessment, package it up, send it to FDA as a GRAS notice for the FDA to review and let us know if they have any questions, and otherwise issue a no questions letter, because that is a form of diligence. If I'm a food ingredient company and I want to make a big splash with customers in a new country, new company, maybe I want to sell to Amazon, for example. Amazon, just for example, would probably want to know that the FDA looked at your safety determination and agreed with it. Food Data petition means that you have a new regulation that's developed as a result of your petition. So it's a lot to really unpack, but hopefully that kind of covers high level the distinction.
Thank you, Brian. Unfortunately, we're short on time, so we'll keep the other questions for next year when you're live here with us in Tel Aviv.
Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was great to join you guys.
It was our honor, and thank you very much.
All right.